Hey guys, welcome to Boxing Squared for boxing news and views from around the internet. From all accounts, boxing promoters have largely operated mostly the same way for decades, past 30-40 years or so. Indeed, a lot of the established promoters that are still around today are familiar faces that have been on the scene plying their trade in the most recent decades. Think Bob Arum, Don King and Frank Warren. As society and technology has changed, and expectations with it, the promoter model it's been tweaked and fiddled around with around the edges, but it's never really been overhauled. While some have gone out on their own to try beat the model, think of Floyd Mayweather and David Haye, the majority of fighters aren't in that position and have been forced to stick with the status quo. And I'm not necessarily saying it's a bad thing. A good promoter can be worth their weight in gold. They'll grease the wheels and do the deals that get fighters in position to fight for titles, and ultimately recognition and better paydays, legacies, all that sort of thing. Glory. In some cases, life-changing paydays as well. But it's certainly not all sweetness and light, not by any stretch. And while we might have largely moved away from the bad old days of the sort of 80s and 90s of promoters fleecing and robbing their fighters blind and taking the lion's share of fight revenue, we do still hear horror stories from time to time where bad contracts have been entered into, or fighters are not getting paid for several months, or sometimes not at all. And that really is shocking. So some would say many promoters have too much power, and they take too large a cut. I mean, the cut side of things, it's really hard to know, as we aren't privy to the financial details. And I don't think many will be opening up their books to the fans, who do generate a decent chunk of the revenue. New players, they come and go all the time. And others, they struggle on and on somehow, and you wonder, how are they keeping going? Surely they must be out of business somehow. I mean, you can probably think of a few who are in that position. One or two for me come to mind. And others, they fold, and a few do strike lightning in a bottle. It does happen. And one of those who have struck lightning in a bottle more recently has been Eddie Hearn. He has climbed the ladder with Matchroom Boxing. So he's gone from strength to strength in recent years. Sure, Anthony Joshua is part of that success, but Hearn's stable is much wider than that. And a lot of fighters are big names in Britain, or they're big names in world boxing. You can think of a number, I'm sure. And like I mentioned, the promoter model, it's been very slow to evolve. And in my view, Hearn has been the most adept recently, and actually sort of moving it on a little bit. He's been adept at harnessing the power of the newer social media platforms. Just look at the way that Eddie Hearn uses YouTube in terms of IFL TV. He uses that channel as basically a default publicist. Say Kugan Cassius or James Helder go round and they talk to Eddie Hearn, they get the latest scoop and they put it out. So they're making their own money, but they're actually doing a job for Eddie Hearn that he didn't even have to pay them for either. So he can keep a lean and mean operation and use the free publicity through social media to help promote his fighters, and more importantly, the events, because, there's the live gate, there's sponsorship, there's all sorts of revenue streams in boxing. I mean, Hearn has also been very sharp on paying his fighters on time and generally a fair rate. The majority of his fighters appear to be generally happy with their purses and the way that they've been promoted. But you do have a few outliers like Luis Ortiz, who, he was on a fight-by-fight contract with Matchroom. He thought that that was gonna lead to a fight with Anthony Joshua or some big fights, and it didn't happen. He left feeling used and abused. And the point I'm trying to make, and it's not one of Eddie Hearn being the best promoter, because I think, best promoters and that sort of stuff, that's up for debate, and we can talk about that till the cows come home. But the point I'm more trying to make is he's taken that model on further, built upon it, and refined certain parts of it. And it's certainly, he's got a few other promoters sort of playing catch up on that. And now he's trying to break into America through Matchroom USA, his offshoot. And he's got a high-profile card set for November, headlined by Danny Jacobs, with chief support from Jarrell Miller. So he has said other promoters in the US will be following his lead with things like his tailored VIP package. And I do note that American promoter Lou DiBella is taking a few pot shots at Hearn's new venture, and I will come to that in a moment. But the real issue that I decided to delve into this issue was more that the Hearn USA thing, it got me thinking about the way that boxing promoters operate, and that it is so last century, it really hasn't moved with the times. Think of how technology has disrupted industries in the past 20 or 30 years and fundamentally changed the way that we work and live. For example, an office computer was very much a novelty for workers back in 1990. When I was going to school, having a computer, and they were pretty crap, it was like, whoa, it's a computer and you could play Lemmings. But really, it had almost zero functionality. But these days, people are spending hours using some form of technology at work and home every single day. You probably don't even realize how much time you spend connected, not just to the internet, but using some forms of technology. And it makes your life and work so much easier and arguably better, some would say worse. But when you apply that to the sort of promoter model, things haven't really changed much. And it got me thinking, some of these older operators, you could kind of compare them to like a cassette tape. And maybe Eddie Hearn is more an upgrade in CD form. But we are still waiting for that digital equivalent, that digital revolution to enter the game and disrupt it entirely. Remember, when digital music took hold, it basically put thousands of music shops around the world out of business overnight. And digital photography sent Kodak into bankruptcy because it couldn't see the change coming, it couldn't adapt, and it couldn't move with that change. So for me, boxing with its very traditional promoter and broadcaster-led model, it's certainly ripe for the picking to be disrupted by something new. Some would say it's much overdue, and we've already seen the signs that maybe things will be changing soon. We've seen a few toes going in the water with new approaches. You know, the recent Parker Fury pay-per-view on YouTube, that's one example. That may not have been the best execution, but it was an approach. It was something new. And we've seen other, fight cards streamed over the internet for some time. But I guess in the same breath you could say those trials, they were led by traditional promoters, whose prime motivation in general has been removing cost from, their operating model, their business model. When you look at some of the things that have disrupted the way that we live our lives these days, and you sort of look back at them and go, man, that's devilishly simple. Like a smartphone, for example, that, you can effectively run major parts of your life from. Shopping, social interaction, banking. Those are just a couple of examples. You can probably think of a dozen more. But what a new boxing promoter model looks like, if in fact there needs to actually be a promoter at all, it's a really tough thing to guess. How would it work? A new model, could it potentially involve more technology, greater use of the internet, social media, complicated algorithms, that sort of thing. But it is hard to see how matchmaking and deal making gets done without a central person or team pushing it, making decisions. I guess maybe the fighter could end up with more control. Use more technology, support them better. Because at the moment, a lot of fighters don't really have a clue about how some of this could work. Perhaps the sanctioning bodies end up trying to cut the middleman, which is the promoter, out of the equation entirely. Maybe they start dealing with fighters direct. But I guess that would certainly be a recipe for more corruption, collusion, and potentially dodgy dealings. But there will be something new at some point. What that is a big question. So I'm really interested to hear your view about how the business of boxing, and it is the business of boxing, might change in the next decade as technology continues to change our lives in general at a rapid rate. I think it would be naive to think that technology won't play some part in boxing in the future, whether that's through scoring or some other means. Eventually something will change, and when it does, it'll happen quickly, and it will alter the landscape. And then we'll look back at the way things were done and think, wow, that was really, really antiquated. Okay, briefly, I will touch on what American promoter Lou DiBella, who's got about 70 fighters under him, has said about Eddie Hearn's push into the US market with Matchroom. A long time ago, Golden Boy was going to come to New York and take it over, and they were going to do it from East LA, and it didn't work out so well. I'm not denigrating them as promoters, but they certainly couldn't do it in New York. And if Eddie thinks that a rich British prep school kid who's out of touch with regular people is somehow going to change the paradigm of boxing in New York, then he's wrong. I doubt that Eddie's getting non-stop calls from major stars in the US. They can take a good look at how Cal Brook was promoted. Promotion is more than just publicity. Was Cal Brook's career or well-being helped by being served up to a bigger, stronger Golovkin? Or being thrown in with a monster like Errol Spence after recovering from surgery and the injuries suffered at the hands of a man so much stronger? I hear Brook didn't make the money he expected from those two grueling fights. So later he added, Eddie Hearn isn't an American promoter or a New York promoter or a New York City kind of guy. I doubt he has ever set foot on Long Island, and he probably thinks that Brooklyn is David Beckham's kid. I wish him no ill will, but my best guess is that he's gonna find out the hard way and could wind up getting booed on 2 continents. Now, DiBella, he does raise some great points, but there's also a bit of the old guard sort of patch protection vibe coming through there as well. I mean, like DiBella says, and this is something I've wondered, how is Hearn going to make a successful fist of things long-term, not just 1 or 2 events, but long-term if he's based in England? I'm sure that he can pull off a good opening show, but stringing them together time after time when you're across the ocean, that feels like that's going to be very hard to keep up, unless you've got boots on the ground that are respected and competent operators. I haven't actually heard who Hearn has pulled in to run his US operations, if anyone at this stage. So DiBella's Golden Boy example is a good cautionary tale. But that doesn't mean that Hearn shouldn't take on the challenge and the task of trying to take over New York. And I guess to add to some of DiBella's point as well, I mean, if you've travelled around much country to country, or even regionally in your own country, things can be slightly different or operate slightly different from place to place. You know, being nuanced. There might be subtle differences that you have to take into account in the way that you operate or do business in general. So I agree, Hearn may need to do things in a slightly nuanced way, slightly different. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach, and that's what DiBella is saying. And Hearn might need to adjust if he's going to make a proper fist of it long term. I guess the other side of that coin is DiBella is certainly coming across as maybe being a bit bitter, and that there's this English upstart who's looking to shake things up. Maybe that could have potentially impact on him and his business. So I'm sure there's a little bit of that, you know, because I mean, everyone who's operating at the moment and doing well for themselves will probably want to keep the status quo. I mean, whether Matchroom USA gains any traction, you know, will be watched with interest. And I think a lot of us, you know, it's quite a bold venture from Eddie Hearn. He obviously thinks he's got the time and the talent and the ability to make a real stab at it. And I'll really watch with interest to see what sort of level of fighters, beyond the couple of names that he's got so far, will come over. You know, he does sort of promise better purses, better exposure, things like that. And Hearn has spoken of fighters needing to be promoted year-round to keep them in the minds of fans. And I do kind of agree on that score. Too often you see fighters have a fight, you hear from them for 3 months, and then they disappear for the next year. I mean, Keith Thurman, that's a classic example. But what do you make of it? And what do you make of it more generally about what I was saying, going back to the future of boxing promoters in general, the business of boxing? What can we expect to see? And what will it be, and how fast will it come? Or are things going to go on as they've always gone on, and we can expect the same sort of lot that we've had? Drop a comment. Let me know. Hit like, hit subscribe. Follow me on Twitter, boxing_squared. I'm out.